Blackstone Audio presents 2666 by Roberto Bolano. Translated by Natasha Wimmer.
For Alexandra Bolano and Lautaro Bolano. A note from the author's heirs. Realizing that death might be near, Roberto left instructions for his novel, 2666, to be published divided into 5 books corresponding to the 5 parts of the novel, specifying the order in which they should appear, at what intervals, 1 per year, and even the price to be negotiated with the publisher. With this decision, communicated days before his death by Roberto himself to Jorge Heralde, Roberto thought he was providing for his children's future. After his death, and following the reading and study of his work and notes by Ignacio Echevarria, a friend of Roberto designated as his literary executor, another consideration of a less practical nature arose: respect for the literary value of the work, which caused us, together with Jorge Heralde, to reverse Roberto's decision and publish 2666 first in full, in a single volume, as he would have done had his illness not taken the gravest course. The part about the critics. The first time that Jean-Claude Peltier read Benno van Archimboldi was Christmas 1980 in Paris when he was 19 years old and studying German literature. The book in question was D'Archimboldi. The young Peltier didn't realize at the time that the novel was part of a trilogy made up of the English-themed The Garden and the Polish-themed The Leather Mask, together with the clearly French-themed D'Archimboldi. But this ignorance or lapse of bibliographical lacuna, attributable only to his extreme youth, did nothing to diminish the wonder and admiration that the novel stirred in him. From that day on, or from the early morning hours when he concluded his maiden reading, he became an enthusiastic Archimboldian and set out on a quest to find more works by the author. This was no easy task. Getting hold of books by Benno van Archimboldi in the 1980s, even in Paris, was an effort not lacking in all kinds of difficulties. Almost no reference to Archimboldi could be found in the university's German department. Peltier's professors had never heard of him. One said he thought he recognized the name. 10 minutes later, to Peltier's outrage and horror, he realized that the person his professor had in mind was the Italian painter, regarding whom he soon revealed himself to be equally ignorant. Peltier wrote to the Hamburg publishing house that had published D'Archimboldi, and received no response. He also scoured the few German bookstores he could find in Paris. The name Archimboldi appeared in a dictionary of German literature and in a Belgian magazine devoted, whether as a joke or seriously he never knew, to the literature of Prussia. In 1981 he made a trip to Bavaria with 3 friends from the German department, and there, in a little bookstore in Munich, on Voralmstrasse, he found 2 other books, the slim volume titled Mitzi's Treasure, less than 100 pages long, and the aforementioned English novel The Garden. Reading these 2 novels only reinforced the opinion he'd already formed of Archimboldi. In 1983, at the age of 22, he undertook the task of translating D'Archimboldi. No one asked him to do it. At the time there was no French publishing house interested in publishing the German author with the funny name. Essentially, Peltier set out to translate the book because he liked it, and because he enjoyed the work, although it occurred to him that he could submit the translation, prefaced with a study of the Archimboldian oeuvre, as his thesis, and, why not, as the foundation of his future dissertation. He completed the final draft of the translation in 1984, and a Paris publishing house, after some inconclusive and contradictory readings, accepted it and published Archimboldi. Though the novel seemed destined from the start not to sell more than 1,000 copies, the first printing of 3,000 was exhausted after a couple of contradictory, positive, even effusive reviews, opening the door for a second, third, and fourth printings. By then Peltier had read 15 books by the German writer, translated 2 others, and was regarded almost universally as the preeminent authority on Benno van Archimboldi across the length and breadth of France. Then Peltier could think back on the day when he first read Archimboldi, and he saw himself, young and poor, living in a chambre de bonne, sharing the sink where he washed his face and brushed his teeth with 15 other people who lived in the same dark garret, shitting in a horrible and notably unhygienic bathroom that was more like a latrine or cesspit, also shared with the 15 residents of the garret, some of whom had already returned to the provinces, their respective university degrees in hand, or had moved to slightly more comfortable places in Paris itself, or were still there, just a few of them, vegetating or slowly dying of revulsion. He saw himself, as we've said, ascetic and hunched over his German dictionaries in the weak light of a single bulb, thin and dogged, as if he were pure will made flesh, bone and muscle without an ounce of fat, fanatical and bent on success. A rather ordinary picture of a student in the capital, but it worked on him like a drug that brought him to tears, a drug that, as one sentimental Dutch poet of the 19th century had it, opened the floodgates of emotion, as well as the floodgates of something that, at first blush, resembled self-pity, but wasn't. What was it then? Rage? Very likely, and made him turn over and over in his mind, not in words, but in painful images, the period of his youthful apprenticeship, and after a perhaps pointless long night, he was forced to 2 conclusions. First, that his life as he had lived it so far was over. Second, that a brilliant career was opening up before him, and that to maintain its glow he had to persist in his determination in sole testament to that garret. This seemed easy enough. Jean-Claude Peltier was born in 1961, and by 1986 he was already a professor of German in Paris. Piero Marini was born in 1956 in a town near Naples, and although he read Benno van Archimboldi for the first time in 1976, or 4 years before Peltier, it wasn't until 1988 that he translated his first novel by the German author, Bifurcaria Bifurcata, which came and went almost unnoticed in Italian bookstores. Archimboldi's situation in Italy, it must be said, was very different from his situation in France. For one thing, Marini wasn't his first translator. As it happened, the first novel by Archimboldi to fall into Marini's hands was a translation of The Leather Mask done by someone called Colosimo for Einaudi in 1969. In Italy, The Leather Mask was followed by Rivers of Europe in 1971, Inheritance in 1973, and Railroad Perfection in 1975. Earlier, in 1964, a publishing house in Rome had put out a collection of mostly war stories titled The Berlin Underworld. So it could be said that Archimboldi wasn't a complete unknown in Italy, although one could hardly claim that he was successful, or somewhat successful, or even barely successful. In point of fact, he was an utter failure, an author whose books languished on the dustiest shelves in the stores, or were remaindered or forgotten in publishers' warehouses before being pulped. Marini, of course, was undaunted by the scant interest that Archimboldi's work aroused in the Italian public, and after he translated Bifurcaria Bifurcata, he wrote 2 studies of Archimboldi for journals in Milan and Palermo, one on the role of fate in Railroad Perfection, and the other on the various guises of conscience and guilt in La Thea, on the surface, an erotic novel, and in Pitzius, a novel less than 100 pages long, similar in some ways to Mitzi's Treasure, the book that Peltier had found in an old Munich bookstore, and that told the story of the life of Albert Bitzius, pastor of Lützeflüh in the canton of Bern, an author of sermons as well as a writer under the pseudonym Jeremiah Gotthelf. Both pieces were published, and Marini's eloquence, or powers of seduction in presenting the figure of Archimboldi, overcame all obstacles, and in 1991 a second translation by Piero Marini, this time of St. Thomas, was published in Italy. By then Marini was teaching German literature at the University of Turin. The doctors had diagnosed him with multiple sclerosis, and he had suffered the strange and spectacular accident that left him permanently wheelchair-bound. Manuel Espinosa came to Archimboldi by a different route. Younger than Marini and Peltier, Espinosa studied Spanish literature, not German literature, at least for the first 2 years of his university career, among other sad reasons because he dreamed of being a writer. The only German authors he was barely familiar with were three greats: Hölderlin, because at 16 he thought he was fated to be a poet, and he devoured every book of poetry he could find; Goethe, because in his final year of secondary school, a teacher with a humorous streak recommended that he read The Sorrows of Young Werther, in whose hero he would find a kindred spirit; and Schiller, because he had read one of his plays. Later he would discover the work of a modern author, Junger, with whom he became acquainted more by osmosis than anything else, since the Madrid writers he admired, and deep down hated bitterly, talked non-stop about Junger. So it could be said that Spinoza was acquainted with just one German author, and that author was Junger. At first he thought Junger's work was magnificent, and since many of the writer's books were translated into Spanish, Spinoza had no trouble finding them and reading them all. He would have preferred it to be less easy. Meanwhile, many of his acquaintances weren't just Junger devotees. Some of them were the author's translators too, which was something Spinoza cared little about, since the glory he coveted was that of the writer, not the translator. As the months and years went by, silently and cruelly as is often the case, Spinoza suffered some misfortunes that made him change his thinking. It didn't take him long, for example, to discover that the group of Jungerians wasn't as Jungerian as he had thought, being instead, like all literary groups, enthralled to the changing seasons. In the fall, it's true, they were Jungerians, but in winter they suddenly turned into Barogians, and in spring into Ortegenites, and in summer they would even leave the bar where they met, to go out into the street and intone pastoral verse in honor of Camilo José Cela, something that the young Spinoza, who was fundamentally patriotic, would have been prepared to accept unconditionally if such displays had been embarked on in a fun-loving, carnivalesque spirit, but who could in no way take it all seriously, as did the bogus Jungerians. Worse was discovering what the members of the group thought about his own attempts at fiction. Their opinion was so negative that there were times, some nights, for example, when he couldn't sleep, that he began to wonder in all seriousness whether they were making a veiled attempt to get him to go away, stop bothering them, never show his face again. And even worse was when Junger showed up in person in Madrid and the group of Jungerians organized a trip to El Escorial for him, a strange whim of the maestro visiting El Escorial, and when Spinoza tried to join the excursion in any capacity whatsoever, he was denied the honor, as if the Jungerians deemed him unworthy of making up part of the Germans' garde du corps, or as if they feared that he, Spinoza, might embarrass them with some naive, abstruse remark, although the official explanation given, perhaps dictated by some charitable impulse, was that he didn't speak German and everyone else who was going on the picnic with Junger did. That was the end of Spinoza's dealings with the Jungerians, and it was the beginning of his loneliness and a steady stream, or deluge, of resolutions, often contradictory or impossible to keep. These weren't comfortable nights, much less pleasant ones, but Spinoza discovered two things that helped him mightily in the early days. He would never be a fiction writer, and, in his own way, he was brave. He also discovered that he was bitter and full of resentment, that he oozed resentment, and that he might easily kill someone, anyone, if it would provide a respite from the loneliness and rain and cold of Madrid. But this was a discovery that he preferred to conceal. Instead, he concentrated on his realization that he would never be a writer, and on making everything he possibly could out of his newly unearthed bravery. He continued at the university, studying Spanish literature, but at the same time he enrolled in the German department. He slept 4 or 5 hours a night, and the rest of the time he spent at his desk. Before he finished his degree in German literature, he wrote a 20-page essay on the relationship between Werther and music, which was published in a Madrid literary magazine and a Göttingen University journal. By the time he was 25, he had completed both degrees. In 1990, he received his doctorate in German literature with a dissertation on Benno von Archimboldi. A Barcelona publishing house brought it out 1 year later. By then, Espinosa was a regular at German literature conferences and round tables. His command of German was, if not excellent, more than passable. He also spoke English and French. Like Morini and Peltier, he had a good job and a substantial income, and he was respected, to the extent possible, by his students as well as his colleagues. He never translated Archimboldi or any other German author. Besides Archimboldi, there was one thing Morini, Peltier, and Espinosa had in common. All three had iron wills. Actually, they had one other thing in common, but we'll get to that later. Liz Norton, on the other hand, wasn't what one would ordinarily call a woman of great drive, which is to say that she didn't draw up long or medium-term plans and throw herself wholeheartedly into their execution. She had none of the attributes of the ambitious. When she suffered, her pain was clearly visible, and when she was happy, the happiness she felt was contagious. She was incapable of setting herself a goal and striving steadily toward it. At least, no goal was appealing or desirable enough for her to pursue it unreservedly. Used in a personal sense, the phrase achieve an end seemed to her a small-minded snare. She preferred the word life, and on rare occasions, happiness. If volition is bound to social imperatives, as William James believed, and it's therefore easier to go to war than it is to quit smoking, one could say that Liz Norton was a woman who found it easier to quit smoking than to go to war. This was something she'd been told once when she was a student, and she loved it, although it didn't make her read William James, then or ever. For her, reading was directly linked to pleasure, not to knowledge or enigmas or constructions or verbal labyrinths, as Morini, Espinosa, and Peltier believed it to be. Her discovery of Archimboldi was the least traumatic of all, and the least poetic. During the 3 months that she lived in Berlin in 1988, when she was 20, a German friend loaned her a novel by an author she had never heard of. The name puzzled her. How was it possible, she asked her friend, that there could be a German writer with an Italian surname, but with a von preceding it, indicating some kind of nobility? Her German friend had no answer. It was probably a pseudonym, he said. And to make things even stranger, he added, masculine proper names ending in vowels were uncommon in Germany. Plenty of feminine proper names ended that way, but certainly not masculine proper names. The novel was The Blind Woman, and she liked it, but not so much that it made her go running out to buy everything else that Benno von Archimboldi had ever written. 5 months later, back in England again, Liz Norton received a gift in the mail from her German friend. As one might guess, it was another novel by Archimboldi. She read it, liked it, went to her college library to look for more books by the German with the Italian name, and found 2. One was the book she had already read in Berlin, and the other was Bitzius. Reading the latter really did make her go running out. It was raining in the quadrangle, and the quadrangular sky looked like the grimace of a robot or a god made in our own likeness. The oblique drops of rain slid down the blades of grass in the park, but it would have made no difference if they had slid up. Then the oblique drops turned round drops, swallowed up by the earth underpinning the grass, and the grass and the earth seemed to talk. No, not talk, argue their incomprehensible words like crystallized spiderwebs, or the briefest crystallized vomitings, a barely audible rustling, as if instead of drinking tea that afternoon, Norton had drunk a steaming cup of peyote. But the truth is that she had only had tea to drink, and she felt overwhelmed, as if a voice were repeating a terrible prayer in her ear, the words of which blurred as she walked away from the college, and the rain wetted her grey skirt and bony knees and pretty ankles and little else, because before Liz Norton went running through the park, she hadn't forgotten to pick up her umbrella. The first time Peltier, Morini, Espinosa, and Norton saw each other was at a contemporary German literature conference held in Bremen in 1994. Peltier and Morini had met before, during the German literature colloquiums held in Leipzig in 1989, when the GDR was in its death throes, and then they saw each other again at the German Literature Symposium held in Mannheim in December of the same year, A disaster, with bad hotels, bad food, and abysmal organizing. At a modern German literature forum in Zurich in 1990, Peltier and Marini met Spinoza. Spinoza saw Peltier again at a 20th century German literature congress held in Maastricht in 1991. Peltier delivered a paper titled Heine and Archimboldi, Converging Paths. Spinoza delivered a paper titled Ernst Jünger and Benno van Archimboldi, Diverging Paths. And it could more or less safely be said that from that moment on, they not only read each other in the scholarly journals, they became friends, or they struck up something like a friendship. In 1992, Peltier, Spinoza, and Marini ran into each other again at a German literature seminar in Augsburg. Each was presenting a paper on Archimboldi. For a few months it had been rumoured that Benno van Archimboldi himself planned to attend this grand event, which would convene not only the usual Germanists, but also a sizable group of German writers and poets, and yet, at the crucial moment, 2 days before the gathering, a telegram was received from Archimboldi's Hamburg publishers tendering his apologies. In every other respect, too, the conference was a failure. In Peltier's opinion, perhaps the only thing of interest was a lecture given by an old professor from Berlin on the work of Arno Schmidt. Here we have a German proper name ending in a vowel, a judgment shared by Spinoza and, to a lesser extent, by Marini. They spent the free time they had, which was ample, strolling the paltry, in Peltier's opinion, sites of interest in Augsburg, a city that Spinoza also found paltry, and that Marini found only moderately paltry, but still paltry in the final analysis, while Spinoza and Peltier took turns pushing the Italian's wheelchair, since Marini wasn't in the best of health this time, but rather in paltry health, so that his two friends and colleagues considered that a little bit of fresh air would do him no harm, and in fact might do him good. Only Peltier and Spinoza attended the next German literature conference, held in Paris in January 1992. Marini, who had been invited too, was in worse health than usual just then, causing his doctor to advise him, among other things, to avoid even short trips. It wasn't a bad conference, and despite their full schedules, Peltier and Spinoza found time to eat together at a little restaurant on the Rue Galande, near Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre, where, besides talking about their respective projects and interests, during dessert they speculated about the health, the ill health, the delicate health, the miserable health of the melancholy Italian, ill health that nevertheless hadn't prevented him from beginning a book on Archimboldi, a book that might be the grand Archimboldian opus, the pilot fish that would swim for a long time beside the great black shark of the German's oeuvre, or so Peltier explained that Marini had told him on the phone. Whether seriously or in jest, he wasn't sure. Both Peltier and Spinoza respected Marini's work, but Peltier's words, spoken as if from inside an old castle or a dungeon dug under the moat of an old castle, sounded like a threat in the peaceful little restaurant on the Rue Galande, and hastened the end of an evening that had begun in an atmosphere of cordiality and contentment. None of this soured Peltier's and Spinoza's relations with Marini. The three met again at a German-language literature colloquium held in Bologna in 1993, and all three contributed to number 46 of the Berlin journal Literary Studies, a monograph devoted to the work of Archimboldi. It wasn't the first time they'd contributed to the journal. In number 44, there'd been a piece by Spinoza on the idea of God in the work of Archimboldi and Unamuno. In number 38, Marini had published an article on the state of German literature instruction in Italy, and in number 37, Peltier had presented an overview of the most important German writers of the 20th century in France and Europe, a text that incidentally sparked more than one protest and even a couple of scoldings. But it's number 46 that matters to us, since not only did it mark the formation of two opposing groups of Archimboldians, Peltier, Marini, and Spinoza versus Schwarz, Borchmeyer, and Pohl, it also contained a piece by Liz Norton, incredibly brilliant, according to Peltier, well argued, according to Spinoza, interesting, according to Marini, a piece that aligned itself, and not at anyone's bidding, with the theses of the three friends, whom it cited on various occasions, demonstrating a thorough knowledge of their studies and monographs published in specialized journals or issued by small presses. Peltier thought about writing her a letter, but in the end he didn't. Espinosa called Peltier and asked whether it wouldn't be a good idea to get in touch with her. Unsure, they decided to ask Morini. Morini abstained from comment. All they knew about Liz Norton was that she taught German literature at a university in London, and that, unlike them, she wasn't a full professor. The Bremen German Literature Conference was highly eventful. Peltier, backed by Morini and Espinosa, went on the attack like Napoleon at Jena, assaulting the unsuspecting German Archimboldi scholars, and the downed flags of Pohl, Schwarz, and Borchmeier were soon routed to the cafes and taverns of Bremen. The young German professors participating in the event were bewildered at first, and then took the side of Peltier and his friends, albeit cautiously. The audience, consisting mostly of university students who had travelled from Göttingen by train or in vans, was also won over by Peltier's fiery and uncompromising interpretations, throwing caution to the winds and enthusiastically yielding to the festive Dionysian vision of ultimate carnival, or penultimate carnival, exegesis upheld by Peltier and Espinosa. 2 days later, Schwarz and his minions counterattacked. They compared Archimboldi to Heinrich Boll. They spoke of suffering. They compared Archimboldi to Günter Grass. They spoke of civic duty. Borchmeier even compared Archimboldi to Friedrich Dürrenmatt and spoke of humour, which seemed to Morini the height of gall. Then Liz Norton appeared, heaven sent, and demolished the counterattack like a Desai, like a Lann, a blonde Amazon who spoke excellent German, if anything too rapidly, and who expounded on Grimmelshausen and Griffius and many others, including Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, better known as Paracelsus. That same night they ate together in a long, narrow tavern near the river, on a dark street flanked by old Hanseatic buildings, some of which looked like abandoned Nazi offices, a tavern they reached by going downstairs, wet from the drizzle. The place couldn't have been more awful, thought Liz Norton, but the evening was long and agreeable, and the friendliness of Peltier, Morini, and Espinosa, who weren't standoffish at all, made her feel at ease. Naturally, she was familiar with most of their work, but what surprised her, pleasantly of course, was that they were familiar with some of hers too. The conversation proceeded in 4 stages. First they laughed about the flaying Norton had given Borchmeier, and about Borchmeier's growing dismay at Norton's increasingly ruthless attacks. Then they talked about future conferences, especially a strange one at the University of Minnesota, supposedly to be attended by 500 professors, translators, and German literature specialists, though Morini had reason to believe the whole thing was a hoax. Then they discussed Benno von Archimboldi and his life, about which so little was known. All of them, from Peltier to Morini, who was talkative that night, though he was usually the quietest, reviewed anecdotes and gossip, compared old vague information for the umpteenth time, and speculated about the secret of the great writer's whereabouts and life, like people endlessly analyzing a favourite movie. And finally, as they walked the wet, bright streets, bright only intermittently, as if Bremen were a machine jolted every so often by brief, powerful electric charges, they talked about themselves. All 4 were single, and that struck them as an encouraging sign. All 4 lived alone, although Liz Norton sometimes shared her London flat with a globe-trotting brother who worked for an NGO and who came back to England only a few times a year. All 4 were devoted to their careers, although Peltier, Espinosa, and Morini had doctorates, and Peltier and Espinosa also chaired their respective departments, whereas Norton was just preparing her dissertation and had no expectation of becoming the head of her university's German department. That night, before he fell asleep, Peltier didn't think back on the squabbles at the conference. Instead, he thought about walking along the streets near the river, and about Liz Norton walking beside him, as Espinosa pushed Morini's wheelchair, and the 4 of them laughed at the little animals of Bremen which watched them or watched their shadows on the pavement while mounted harmoniously, innocently, on each other's backs. From that day on, or that night on, not a week went by without the four of them calling back and forth regularly, sometimes at the oddest hours, without a thought for the phone bill. Sometimes it was Liz Norton who would call Espinosa and ask about Marini, whom she'd talked to the day before and whom she'd thought seemed a little depressed. That same day Espinosa would call Peltier and inform him that, according to Norton, Marini's health had taken a turn for the worse, to which Peltier would respond by immediately calling Marini, asking him bluntly how he was, laughing with him, because Marini did his best never to talk seriously about his condition, exchanging a few unimportant remarks about work, and later telephoning Norton, maybe at midnight, after putting off the pleasure of the call with a frugal and exquisite dinner, and assuring her that as far as could be hoped, Marini was fine, normal, stable, and what Norton had taken for depression was just the Italian's natural state, sensitive as he was to changes in the weather. Maybe the weather had been bad in Turin. Maybe Marini had dreamed who knows what kind of horrible dream the night before, thus ending a cycle that would begin again a day later, or 2 days later, with Marini calling Espinosa for no reason, just to say hello, that was all, to talk for a while, the call invariably taken up with unimportant things, remarks about the weather, as if Marini and even Espinosa were adopting British conversational habits, film recommendations, dispassionate commentary on recent books, in short, a generally soporific, or at best listless phone conversation, but one that Espinosa followed with odd enthusiasm, or feigned enthusiasm, or fondness, or at least civilized interest, and that Marini attended to as if his life depended on it, and which was succeeded 2 days or a few hours later by Espinosa calling Norton and having a conversation along essentially the same lines, and Norton calling Peltier, and Peltier calling Marini, with the whole process starting over again days later, the call transmuted into hyper-specialized code, signifier and signified in Archimboldi, text, subtext, and paratext, reconquest of the verbal and physical territoriality in the final pages of Bitzius, which, under the circumstances, was the same as talking about film or problems in the German department or the clouds that passed incessantly over their respective cities, morning to night. They met again at the post-war European Literature Colloquium held in Avignon at the end of 1994. Norton and Marini went as spectators, although their trips were funded by their universities, and Peltier and Espinosa presented papers on the import of Archimboldi's work. Peltier's paper focused on insularity, on the rupture that seemed to separate the whole of Archimboldi's oeuvre from the German tradition, though not from a larger European tradition. Espinosa's paper, one of the most engaging he ever wrote, revolved around the mystery veiling the figure of Archimboldi, about whom virtually no one, not even his publisher, knew anything. His books appeared with no author photograph on the flaps or back cover. His biographical data was minimal. German writer, born in Prussia in 1920. His place of residence was a mystery, although at some point his publisher let slip in front of a Spiegel reporter that one of his manuscripts had arrived from Sicily. None of his surviving fellow writers had ever seen him. No biography of him existed in German, even though sales of his books were rising in Germany as well as in the rest of Europe, and even in the United States, which likes vanished writers or millionaire writers, or the legend of vanished writers, and where his work was beginning to circulate widely, no longer just in German departments, but on campus and off campus, in the vast cities with a love for the oral and the visual arts. At night, Peltier, Marini, Espinosa, and Norton would have dinner together, sometimes accompanied by 1 or 2 German professors whom they'd known for a long time, and who would usually retire early to their hotels, or stay until the end of the evening but remain discreetly in the background, as if they understood that the four-cornered figure formed by the Archimboldians was inviolable, and also liable to react violently to any outside interference at that hour of the night. By the end, it was always just the four of them walking the streets of Avignon, as blithely and happily as they'd walked the grimy, bureaucratic streets of Bremen, and as they would walk the many streets awaiting them in the future. Norton pushing Marini with Peltier to her left and Espinosa to her right, or Peltier pushing Marini with Espinosa to his left and Norton walking backward ahead of them and laughing with all the might of her 26 years, a magnificent laugh that they were quick to imitate, although they would surely have preferred not to laugh, but just to look at her, or the four of them abreast and halted beside the low wall of a storied river, in other words, a river tamed, talking about their German obsession without interrupting one another, testing and savouring one another's intelligence, with long intervals of silence that not even the rain could disturb. When Peltier returned from Avignon at the end of 1994, when he opened the door to his apartment in Paris and set his bag on the floor and closed the door, when he poured himself a glass of whisky and opened the drapes and saw the usual view, a slice of the Place de Breteuil with the UNESCO building in the background, when he took off his jacket and left the whisky in the kitchen and listened to the messages on the answering machine, when he felt drowsiness, heaviness in his eyelids, but instead of getting into bed and going to sleep, he undressed and took a shower. When wrapped in a white bathrobe that reached almost to his ankles, he turned on the computer. Only then did he realize that he missed Liz Norton, and that he would have given anything to be with her at that moment, not just talking to her, but in bed with her, telling her that he loved her, and hearing from her lips that she loved him too. Espinosa experienced something similar, though slightly different in two respects. First, the need to be near Liz Norton struck some time before he got back to his apartment in Madrid. By the time he was on the plane, he'd realized that she was the perfect woman, the one he'd always hoped to find, and he began to suffer. Second, among the ideal images of Norton that passed at supersonic speed through his head as the plane flew towards Spain at 400 miles an hour, there were more sex scenes than Peltier had imagined. Not many more, but more. Meanwhile, Marini, who travelled by train from Avignon to Turin, spent the trip reading the cultural supplement of Il Manifesto, and then he slept until a couple of ticket collectors, who would help him onto the platform in his wheelchair, let him know that they'd arrived. As for what passed through Liz Norton's head, it's better not to say. Still, the friendship of the four Archimboldians continued in the same fashion as ever, unshakable, shaped by a greater force that the four didn't resist, even though it meant relegating their personal desires to the background. In 1995, they met at a panel discussion on contemporary German literature held in Amsterdam, a discussion within the framework of a larger discussion that was taking place in the same building, although in separate lecture halls, encompassing French, English, and Italian literature. It goes without saying that most of the attendees of these curious discussions gravitated toward the hall where contemporary English literature was being discussed, next door to the German literature hall and separated from it by a wall that was clearly not made of stone, as walls used to be, but of fragile bricks covered with a thin layer of plaster, so that the shouts, howls, and especially the applause sparked by English literature could be heard in the German literature room as if the two talks or dialogues were one, or as if the Germans were being mocked, when not drowned out, by the English, not to mention by the massive audience attending the English or Anglo-Indian discussion, notably larger than the sparse and earnest audience attending the German discussion, which in the final analysis was a good thing, because it's common knowledge that a conversation involving only a few people, with everyone listening to everyone else and taking time to think and not shouting, tends to be more productive, or at least more relaxed, than a mass conversation, which runs the permanent risk of becoming a rally, or, because of the necessary brevity of the speeches, a series of slogans that fade as soon as they're put into words. But before coming to the crux of the matter, or of the discussion, a rather petty detail that nonetheless affected the course of events must be noted. On a last-minute whim, the organizers, the same people who'd left out contemporary Spanish and Polish and Swedish literature for lack of time or money, earmarked most of the funds to provide luxurious accommodations for the stars of English literature, and with the money left over, they brought in 3 French novelists, an Italian poet, an Italian short story writer, and 3 German writers. The first 2 of them novelists from West and East Berlin, now reunified, both vaguely renowned, and both of whom arrived in Amsterdam by train and made no complaint when they were put up at a 3-star hotel. And the third, a rather shadowy figure about whom no one knew anything, not even Marini, who, presenter or not, knew quite a bit about contemporary German literature. And when the shadowy writer, who was Schwabian, began to reminisce during his talk, or discussion, about his stint as a journalist, as an editor of arts pages, as an interviewer of all kinds of writers and artists, wary of interviews, and then began to recall the era in which he had served as cultural promoter in towns that were far-flung, or simply forgotten, but interested in culture, suddenly, out of the blue, Archimboldi's name cropped up, maybe prompted by the previous talk led by Espinosa and Peltier, since the Schwabian, as it happened, had met Archimboldi while he was cultural promoter for a Frisian town north of Wilhelmshaven, facing the Black Sea coast and the East Frisian Islands, a place where it was cold, very cold, and even wetter than it was cold, with a salty wetness that got into the bones, and there were only 2 ways of making it through the winter. 1, drinking until you got cirrhosis, and 2, listening to music, usually amateur string quartets in the town hall auditorium, or talking to writers who came from elsewhere and who were given very little, a room at the only boarding house in town, and a few marks to cover the return trip by train, those trains so unlike German trains today, but on which the people were perhaps more talkative, more polite, more interested in their neighbours, but anyway, writers who, after being paid and subtracting transportation costs, left these places and went home, which was sometimes just a room in Frankfurt or Cologne, with a little money and possibly a few books sold, in the case of those writers or poets, especially poets, who, after reading a few pages and answering the townspeople's questions, would set up a table and make a few extra marks, a fairly profitable activity back then, because if the audience liked what the writer had read, or if the reading moved them or entertained them or made them think, then they would buy one of his books, sometimes to keep as a souvenir of a pleasant evening, as the wind whistled along the narrow streets of the Frisian town, cutting into the flesh, it was so cold, sometimes to read or reread a poem or story, back at home now, weeks after the event, maybe by the light of an oil lamp, because there wasn't always electricity, of course, since the war had just ended, and there were still gaping wounds. Social and economic, anyway, more or less the same as a literary reading today, with the exception that the books displayed on the table were self-published, and now it's the publishing houses that set up the table, and one of these writers who came to the town where the Schwabian was cultural promoter was Benno von Archimboldi, a writer of the stature of Gustav Heller, or Rainer Kuhl, or Wilhelm Frein, writers whom Marini would later look up in his Encyclopedia of German Authors without success. And he didn't bring books, and he read 2 chapters from a novel in progress, his second novel. The first, remembered the Schwabian, had been published in Hamburg that year, although he didn't read anything from it. But that first novel did exist, said the Schwabian, and Archimboldi, as if anticipating doubts, had brought a copy with him, a little novel about 100 pages long, maybe longer, 120, 125 pages, and he carried the novel in his jacket pocket, and, strangely, the Schwabian remembered Archimboldi's jacket more clearly than the novel crammed into its pocket, a little novel with a dirty creased cover that had once been deep ivory or a pale wheat colour, or gold, shading into invisibility, but now was colourless and dull, just the title of the novel and the author's name and the colophon of the publishing house, whereas the jacket was unforgettable, a black leather jacket with a high collar, providing excellent protection against the snow and rain and cold, loose-fitting so it could be worn over heavy sweaters, or 2 sweaters, without anyone noticing, with horizontal pockets on each side, and a row of 4 buttons, neither very large nor very small, sewn on with something like fishing line, a jacket that brought to mind, why, I don't know, the jackets worn by some Gestapo officers, although back then black leather jackets were in fashion, and anyone who had the money to buy one, or had inherited one, wore it without stopping to think about what it suggested. And the writer who had come to that Frisian town was Benno von Archimboldi, the young Benno von Archimboldi, 29 or 30 years old, and it had been he, the Schwabian, who had gone to wait for him at the train station, and who had accompanied him to the boarding-house, talking about the weather, which was bad, and then had brought him to City Hall, where Archimboldi hadn't set up any table, and had read 2 chapters from a novel that wasn't finished yet, and then the Schwabian had gone to dinner with him at the local tavern, along with a teacher and a widow who preferred music or painting to literature, but who, once resigned to not having music or painting, was in no way averse to a literary evening, and it was she who somehow or other kept up the conversation during dinner, sausages and potatoes and beer. Neither the Times, recalled the Schwabian, nor the town's budget allowed for anything more extravagant, although it might be truer to say that she steered it with a firm hand on the rudder, and the men who were around the table, the mayor's secretary, a man in the salted fish business, an old schoolteacher who kept falling asleep even with his fork in his hand, and a town employee, a very nice boy named Fritz, who was a good friend of the Schwabians, nodded or were careful not to contradict the redoubtable widow, whose knowledge of the arts was much greater than anyone else's, even the Schwabians, and who had travelled in Italy and France, and had even, on one of her voyages, an unforgettable ocean crossing, gone as far as Buenos Aires in 1927 or 1928, when the city was a meat emporium, and the refrigerator ships left port laden with meat, a sight to see, hundreds of ships arriving empty and leaving laden with tons of meat headed all over the world, and when she, the lady, went out on deck, say, at night, half asleep or seasick or ailing, all she had to do was lean on the rail and let her eyes grow accustomed to the dark, and then the view of the port was startling, and it instantly cleared away any vestiges of sleep or seasickness or other ailments, the nervous system having no choice but to surrender unconditionally to such a picture, the parade of immigrants like ants loading the flesh of thousands of dead cattle into the ship's holds, the movements of pallets piled with the meat of thousands of sacrificed calves, and the gauzy tint that shaded every corner of the port from dawn until dusk, and even during the night shifts, the red of barely cooked steak, of T-bones, of filet, of ribs grilled rare, terrible. Thank goodness the lady, who wasn't a widow at the time, had to see it only the first night. Then they disembarked and took rooms at one of the most expensive hotels in Buenos Aires, and they went to the opera, and then to a ranch where her husband, an expert horseman, agreed to race with the rancher's son, who lost, and then with a ranch hand, the son's right-hand man, a gaucho, who also lost, and then with the gaucho's son, a little 16-year-old gaucho, thin as a reed and with bright eyes, so bright that when the lady looked at him he lowered his head, and then lifted it a little and gave her such a wicked look that she was offended. What an insolent urchin! While her husband laughed and said in German, "You've made quite an impression on the boy," a joke the lady didn't find the least bit funny. And then the little gaucho mounted his horse and they set off. The boy could really gallop. He clung to the horse so tightly it was as if he were glued to its neck, and he sweated and thrashed it with his whip. But in the end, her husband won the race. He hadn't been captain of a cavalry regiment for nothing, and the rancher and the rancher's son got up from their seats and clapped, good losers, and the rest of the guests clapped too. Excellent rider, this German, extraordinary rider, although when the little gaucho reached the finish line, or in other words, the porch, he didn't look like a good loser, a dark, angry expression on his face, his head down, and while the men, speaking French, scattered along the porch in search of glasses of ice-cold champagne, the lady went up to the little gaucho, who was left standing alone, holding his horse's reins in his left hand. At the other end of the long yard, the little gaucho's father headed off toward the stables with the horse the German had ridden, and told him, in an incomprehensible language, not to be sad, that he had ridden an excellent race, but her husband was good too, and more experienced. Words that to the little gaucho sounded like the moon, like the passage of clouds across the moon, like a slow storm. And then the little gaucho looked up at the lady with the eyes of a bird of prey, ready to plunge a knife into her at the navel and slice up to the breasts, cutting her wide open, his eyes shining with a strange intensity, like the eyes of a clumsy young butcher, as the lady recalled, which didn't stop her from following him without protest when he took her by the hand and led her to the other side of the house, to a place where a wrought-iron pergola stood, bordered by flowers and trees that the lady had never seen in her life, or which, at that moment, she thought she had never seen in her life, And she even saw a fountain in the park, a stone fountain, in the centre of which, balanced on one little foot, a Creole cherub with smiling features danced, part European and part cannibal, perpetually bathed by 3 jets of water that spouted at its feet, a fountain sculpted from a single piece of black marble, a fountain that the lady and the little gaucho admired at length, until a distant cousin of the rancher appeared, or a mistress whom the rancher had lost in the deep folds of memory, telling her in brusque and serviceable English that her husband had been looking for her for some time. And then the lady walked out of the enchanted park on the distant cousin's arm, and the little gaucho called to her, or so she thought, and when she turned, he spoke a few hissing words, and the lady stroked his head and asked the cousin what the little gaucho had said, her fingers lost in the thick curls of his hair. And the cousin seemed to hesitate for a moment, but the lady, who wouldn't tolerate lies or half-truths, demanded an immediate direct translation, and the cousin said, He says the boss arranged it so your husband would win the last 2 races. And then the cousin was quiet, and the little gaucho went off toward the other end of the park, dragging on his horse's reins, and the lady rejoined the party, but she couldn't stop thinking about what the little gaucho had confessed at the last moment, the sainted lamb, and no matter how much she thought, his words were still a riddle that lasted the rest of the party, and tormented her as she tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep, and made her listless the next day during a long horseback ride and barbecue, and followed her back to Buenos Aires, and all through the days she was at the hotel, or went out to receptions at the German embassy, or the English embassy, or the Ecuadorian embassy, and was solved only days after her ship set sail for Europe, one night, at 4 a.m, when the lady went out to stroll the deck, not knowing or caring what parallel or longitude they were at, surrounded or partially surrounded by 41 million square miles of salt water. Just then, as the lady lit a cigarette on the first-class passenger's first deck, with her eyes fixed on the expanse of ocean that she couldn't see but could hear, the riddle was miraculously solved. And it was then, at that point in the story, said the Schwabian, that the lady, the once rich and powerful and intelligent, in her fashion at least, Frisian lady, fell silent, and a religious, or worse, superstitious hush fell over that sad post-war German tavern, where everyone began to feel more and more uncomfortable and hurried to mop up what was left of their sausage and potatoes and swallow the last drops of beer from their mugs, as if they were afraid that at any moment the lady would begin to howl like a fury, and they judged it wise to prepare themselves to face the cold journey home with full stomachs. And then the lady spoke. She said, "Can anyone solve the riddle?" That's what she said, but she didn't look at any of the townspeople or address them directly. "Does anyone know the answer to the riddle? Does anyone understand it? Is there by chance a man in this town who can tell me the solution, even if he has to whisper it in my ear?" She said all of this with her eyes on her plate, where her sausage and her serving of potatoes remained almost untouched. And then Archimboldi, who had kept his head down, eating, as the lady talked, said, without raising his voice, that it had been an act of hospitality, that the rancher and his son were sure the lady's husband would lose the first race, and they had rigged the second and third races so the former cavalry captain would win. Then the lady looked him in the eye and laughed, and asked why her husband had won the first race. "Why? Why?" asked the lady. "Because the rancher's son," said Archimboldi, who surely rode better and had a better mount than your husband, "was overcome at the last minute by selflessness. In other words, he chose extravagance, carried away by the impromptu festivities that he and his father had arranged. Everything had to be squandered, including his victory, and somehow everyone understood it had to be that way, including the woman who came looking for you in the park. Everyone except the little gaucho." "Was that all?" asked the lady. "Not for the little gaucho. If you'd spent any longer with him, I think he would have killed you, which would have been an extravagant gesture in its own right, though certainly not the kind the rancher and his son had in mind." Then the lady got up, thanked everyone for a pleasant evening, and left. "A few minutes later," said the Schwabian, "I walked Archimboldi back to the boarding-house. The next morning, when I went to get him to take him to the station, he was gone. Astounding Schwabian, said Espinosa. I want him all to myself, said Peltier. Try not to overwhelm him. Try not to seem too interested, said Marini. We have to treat the man with kid gloves, said Norton, which means we have to be very nice to him. But the Schwabian had already said everything he had to say, and even though they coddled him and took him out to the best restaurant in Amsterdam, and complimented him and talked to him about hospitality and extravagance, and the fate of cultural promoters trapped in small provincial towns, it was impossible to get anything interesting out of him, although the four were careful to record every word he spoke, as if they'd met their Moses, a detail that didn't go unnoticed by the Schwabian, and in fact heightened his shyness, which, according to Espinosa and Peltier, was such an unusual trait in a former cultural promoter that they thought the Schwabian must be some kind of impostor. His reserve, his discretion, which verged on the improbable omerta of an old Nazi who smells danger. 15 days later, Espinosa and Peltier took a few days' leave and went to Hamburg to visit Archimboldi's publisher. They were received by the editor-in-chief, a thin, upright man in his 60s by the name of Schnell, which means quick, although Schnell was on the slow side. He had sleek dark brown hair, sprinkled with grey at the temples, which only accentuated his youthful appearance. When he got up to shake hands, it occurred to both Espinosa and Peltier that he must be gay. That faggot is the closest thing to an eel I've ever seen, Espinosa said afterward, as they strolled through Hamburg. Peltier chided him for his comment, with its markedly homophobic overtones, although deep down he agreed there was something eel-like about Schnell, something of the fish that swims in dark, muddy waters. Of course, there was little Schnell could tell them that they didn't already know. He had never seen Archimboldi, and the money, of which there was more and more, was deposited in a Swiss bank account. Once every 2 years, instructions were received from the writer, the letters usually postmarked Italy, although there were also letters in the publisher's files with Greek and Spanish and Moroccan stamps, letters, incidentally, that were addressed to Mrs. Bubis, the owner of the publishing house, and that he, naturally, hadn't read. There are only 2 people left here, besides Mrs. Bubis, of course, who've met Benno von Archimboldi in person, Schnell told them, the publicity director and the copy chief. By the time I came to work here, Archimboldi had long since vanished. Peltier and Espinosa asked to speak to both women. The publicity director's office was full of plants and photographs, not necessarily of the house authors, and the only thing she could tell them about the vanished writer was that he was a good person. A tall man, very tall, she said. When he walked beside the late Mr. Bubis, they looked like a T or a Li. Espinosa and Peltier didn't understand what she meant, and the publicity director wrote the letter L and then the letter I on a scrap of paper. Or maybe more like a L, like this. And again she wrote something on the scrap of paper. L. The L is Archimboldi, the E is the late Mr. Bubis. Then the publicity director laughed and watched them for a while, reclining in her swivel chair in silence. Later they talked to the copy chief. She was about the same age as the publicity director, but not as cheery. She said yes, she had met Archimboldi many years ago, but she didn't remember his face anymore, or what he was like, or any story about him that would be worth telling. She couldn't remember the last time he was at the publishing house. She advised them to speak to Mrs. Bubis, and then, without a word, she busied herself editing a galley, answering the other copy editor's questions, talking on the phone to people who might, Espinosa and Peltier thought with pity, be translators. Before they left, refusing to be discouraged, they returned to Schnell's office and talked to him about Archimboldian conferences and colloquiums planned for the future. Schnell, attentive and cordial, told them they could count on him for whatever they might need. Since they didn't have anything to do except wait for their flights back to Paris and Madrid, Peltier and Espinosa went walking around Hamburg. The walk inevitably took them to the district of streetwalkers and peep-shows, and then they both lapsed into gloom and began telling each other stories of love and disillusionment. Of course, they didn't give names or dates. They spoke in what might be called abstract terms. But despite the seemingly detached presentation of their misfortunes, the conversation and the walk only sank them deeper into a state of melancholy, to such a degree that after 2 hours they both felt as if they were suffocating. They took a taxi back to the hotel in silence. A surprise awaited them there. At the desk there was a note from Schnell addressed to both of them, in which he explained that after their conversation that morning, he'd decided to talk to Mrs. Bubis, and she had agreed to see them. The next morning, Espinosa and Peltier called at the publisher's apartment, on the 3rd floor of an old building in Hamburg's upper town. As they waited, they looked at the framed photographs on one wall. On the other 2 walls there were canvases by Sutin and Kandinsky, and several drawings by Grosz, Kokoschka, and Ensor. But Espinosa and Peltier were much more interested in the photographs, which were almost all of writers they disdained or admired, and, in any case, had read. Thomas Mann, with Bubis, Heinrich Mann, with Bubis, Klaus Mann, with Bubis, Alfred Döblin, with Bubis, Hermann Hesse, with Bubis, Walter Benjamin, with Bubis, Anna Segers, with Bubis, Stefan Zweig, with Bubis, Bertolt Brecht, with Bubis, Feuchtwanger, with Bubis, Johannes Becher, with Bubis, Oskar Maria Graf, with Bubis. Bodies and faces and vague scenery beautifully framed. With the innocence of the dead, who no longer mind being observed, the people in the photographs gazed out on the professor's barely contained enthusiasm. When Mrs. Bubis appeared, the 2 of them had their heads together trying to decide whether a man next to Bubis was Falada or not. "Indeed, it is Falada," said Mrs. Bubis. When they turned, Peltier and Espinosa saw an older woman in a white blouse and black skirt, a woman with a figure like Marlene Dietrich, as Peltier would say much later, a woman who, despite her years, was still as strong-willed as ever, a woman who didn't cling to the edge of the abyss, but plunged into it with curiosity and elegance, a woman who plunged into the abyss sitting down. "My husband knew all the German writers, and the German writers loved and respected my husband, even if a few of them said horrible things about him later that weren't always even accurate," said Mrs. Bubis with a smile. They talked about Archimboldi, and Mrs. Bubis had tea and cakes brought in, although she drank vodka, which surprised Espinosa and Peltier. Not that she would start to drink so early, but that she wouldn't offer them a drink too, a drink they would, in any case, have refused. "The only person at the press who knew Archimboldi's work to perfection," said Mrs. Bubis, "was Mr. Bubis, who published all his books." But she asked herself, and by extension the 2 of them, how well anyone could really know another person's work. "For example, I love Grosch's work," she said, gesturing toward the Grosch drawings on the wall. "But do I really know it? His stories make me laugh. Often I think Grosch drew what he did to make me laugh. Sometimes I laugh to the point of hilarity, and hilarity becomes helpless mirth. But once I met an art critic, who of course liked Grosch, and who nevertheless got very depressed when he attended a retrospective of his work, or had to study some canvas or drawing in a professional capacity. And these bouts of depression or sadness would last for weeks. This art critic was a friend, but we'd never discussed Grosch. Once, however, I mentioned the effect Grosch had on me. At first he refused to believe me. Then he started to shake his head. Then he looked me up and down as if he'd never laid eyes on me before. I thought he'd gone mad. That was the end of our friendship. A while ago I was told that he still says I know nothing about Grosch, and I have the aesthetic sense of a cow. Well, as far as I'm concerned, he can say whatever he likes. Grosch makes me laugh. Grosch depresses him, but who can say they really know Grosch? Let's suppose, said Mrs. Bubis, that at this very moment there's a knock on the door, and my old friend the art critic comes in. He sits here on the sofa beside me, and one of you brings out an unsigned drawing and tells us it's by Grosch, and you want to sell it. I look at the drawing and smile, and I take out my checkbook and buy it. The art critic looks at the drawing and isn't depressed, and tries to make me reconsider. He thinks it isn't a Grosch. I think it is. Which of us is right? Or Let's tell a story a different way. You, said Mrs. Bubis, pointing to Espinosa, present an unsigned drawing and say it's by Grosch and try to sell it. I don't laugh. I look at it coldly. I appreciate the line, the control, the satire, but nothing about it tickles me. The art critic examines it carefully and gets depressed in his normal way. And then and there he makes an offer that exceeds his savings, and that, if accepted, will condemn him to endless afternoons of melancholy. I try to change his mind. I tell him the drawing strikes me as suspicious because it doesn't make me laugh. The critic says finally I'm looking at Grosch like an adult and gives me his congratulations. Which of the two of us is right? Then they went back to talking about Archimboldi, and Mrs. Bubis showed them a very odd review that had appeared in a Berlin newspaper after the publication of Lüdecker, Archimboldi's first novel. The review, by someone named Schleiermacher, tried to sum up the novelist's personality in a few words. Intelligence, average. Character, epileptic. Scholarship, sloppy. Storytelling ability, chaotic. Prosody, chaotic. German usage, chaotic. Average intelligence and sloppy scholarship are easy to understand. What did he mean by epileptic character, though? That Archimboldi had epilepsy? That he wasn't right in the head? That he suffered attacks of a mysterious nature? That he was a compulsive reader of Dostoevsky? There was no physical description of the writer in the piece. "We never knew who this man Schleiermacher was," said Mrs. Bubis, "and sometimes my late husband would joke that Archimboldi himself had written the review. But he knew as well as I did that it wasn't true." Near midday, when it was time to leave, Peltier and Espinosa dared to ask the only question they thought really mattered. Could she help them get in touch with Archimboldi? Mrs. Bubis's eyes lit up. As if she were at the scene of a fire, Peltier told Liz Norton later. Not a raging blaze, but a fire that was about to go out after burning for months. Her no came as a slight shake of the head that made Peltier and Espinosa abruptly aware of the futility of their plea. Still, they stayed a while longer. From somewhere in the house came the muted strains of an Italian popular song. Espinosa asked whether she knew Archimboldi, whether she had ever seen him in person while her husband was alive. Mrs. Bubis said she had, and then, under her breath, she sang the song's final chorus. Her Italian, according to the two friends, was very good. "What is Archimboldi like?" asked Espinosa. "Very tall," said Mrs. Bubis. "Very tall. A man of truly great height. If he'd been born in this day and age, he likely would have played basketball." Although by the way she said it, Archimboldi might as well have been a dwarf. In the taxi back to the hotel, the two friends thought about Grosch, and about Mrs. Bubis's cruel, crystalline laugh, and about the impression left by that house full of photographs, where, nevertheless, the photograph of the only writer they cared about was missing. And although neither wanted to admit it, both believed, or sensed, that the flash of insight granted to them in the red light district was more important than any revelation they might have scented as the guests of Mrs. Bubis. In a word, and bluntly, as they walked around St. Pauli, it came to Peltier and Espinosa that the search for Archimboldi could never fill their lives. They could read him, they could study him, they could pick him apart, but they couldn't laugh or be sad with him, partly because Archimboldi was always far away, partly because the deeper they went into his work, the more it devoured its explorers. In a word, in St. Pauli and later at Mrs. Bubis's house, hung with photographs of the late Mr. Bubis and his writers, Peltier and Espinosa understood that what they wanted to make was love, not war. That afternoon, and without indulging in any confidences beyond the strictly necessary, confidences in general, or maybe abstract terms, they shared another taxi to the airport, and as they waited for their planes they talked about love, about the need for love. Peltier was the first to go. When Espinosa was left alone, his flight was an hour later, his thoughts turned to Liz Norton and his real chances of wooing her. He imagined her, and then he imagined himself, side by side, sharing an apartment in Madrid, going to the supermarket, both of them working in the German department. He imagined his office and her office, separated by a wall, and nights in Madrid next to her, eating with friends at good restaurants, and back at home, an enormous bathtub, an enormous bed. But Peltier got there first. 3 days after the meeting with Archimboldi's publisher, he showed up in London unannounced, and after telling Liz Norton the latest news, he invited her to dinner at a restaurant in Hammersmith that a colleague in the Russian department had recommended, where they ate goulash and chickpea puree with beets and fish macerated in lemon with yogurt, a dinner with candles and violins and real Russian waiters, and Irish waiters disguised as Russians, all of it excessive from any point of view, and somewhat rustic and dubious from a gastronomic point of view, and they had vodka with their dinner and a bottle of Bordeaux, and the whole meal cost Peltier an arm and a leg. But it was worth it, because then Norton invited him home, officially to discuss Archimboldi and the few things that Mrs. Bubis had revealed, including, of course, the critic Schleiermacher's contemptuous appraisal of Archimboldi's first book, and then both of them started to laugh, and Peltier kissed Norton on the lips, with great tact, and she kissed him back much more ardently, thanks possibly to the dinner and the vodka and the Bordeaux, but Peltier thought it showed promise, and then they went to bed and screwed for an hour until Norton fell asleep. That night, while Liz Norton was sleeping, Peltier remembered a long-ago afternoon when he and Espinosa had watched a horror film in a room at a German hotel. The film was Japanese, and in one of the early scenes there were 2 teenage girls. One was telling a story. The story was about a boy spending his holidays in Kobe, who wanted to go out to play with friends at the same time that his favorite TV show was on. So the boy found a video cassette and set the machine to record the show and went outside. The problem was that the boy was from Tokyo, and in Tokyo his show was on Channel 34, whereas in Kobe, Channel 34 is blank, a channel on which all you see is snow. And after he came back in, when he sat down in front of the TV and started the player, instead of his favorite show he saw a white-faced woman telling him he was going to die. And that was all. And then the phone rang, and the boy answered, and he heard the same woman's voice asking him did he think it was a joke. A day later they found him in the yard, dead. And the first girl told the second girl this story, and the whole time she was talking it looked like she was about to crack up. The second girl was obviously scared, but the first girl, the one who was telling the story, looked like she was about to roll on the floor laughing. And then, remembered Peltier, Espinosa said the first girl was a 2-bit psychopath, and the second girl was a silly bitch, and the film could have been good if the second girl, instead of staring open-mouthed and looking horrified, had told the first one to shut up. And not gently, not politely. Instead, she should have told the girl, "Shut up, you cunt! What's so funny? Does it turn you on telling the story of a dead boy? Does it make you come telling the story of a dead boy, you imaginary dick-sucking bitch?" And so on in the same vein. And Peltier remembered that Espinosa spoke so vehemently, he even did the voice the second girl should have used, and the way she should have stood, and he thought it best to turn off the TV and take him to the bar for a drink before they went back to their rooms. And he also remembered that he felt tenderness toward Espinosa at that moment, a tenderness that brought back adolescence, adventures fiercely shared, and small-town afternoons. That week, Liz Norton's home phone rang 3 or 4 times every afternoon, and her cell phone rang 2 or 3 times every morning. The calls were from Peltier and Espinosa, and although both produced elaborate Archimboldian pretexts, the pretexts were exhausted in a minute, and the 2 professors proceeded to say what was really on their minds. Peltier talked about his colleagues in the German department, about a young Swiss poet and professor who was badgering him for a scholarship, about the sky in Paris, shades of Baudelaire, Verlaine, Banville, about the cars at dusk, their lights already on, heading home. Espinosa talked about his library, where he arranged his books in the strictest solitude, about the distant drums that he sometimes heard coming from a neighbouring apartment that seemed to be home to a group of African musicians, about the neighbourhoods of Madrid, Lavapiés, Malasaña, and about the area around the Gran Via, where you could go for a walk at any time of night. During this period, both Espinosa and Peltier completely forgot about Marini. Only Norton called him now and then, carrying on the same conversations as ever. In his way, Morini had vanished from sight. Soon Peltier got used to travelling to London whenever he wanted, though it must be emphasised that in terms of proximity and ready modes of transportation, he had it easiest. These visits lasted only a single night. Peltier would arrive just after 9, meeting Norton at 10 at a restaurant where he had made reservations from Paris, and by 1 they were in bed. Liz Norton was a passionate lover, although her passion was of limited duration. Not having much imagination of her own, she abandoned herself to any game her lover suggested, without ever taking the initiative or thinking she ought to. These sessions rarely lasted more than 3 hours, a fact that occasionally saddened Peltier, who would gladly have screwed till daybreak. After the sexual act, and this was what frustrated Peltier most, Norton preferred to talk about academic matters rather than to look frankly at what was developing between them. To Peltier, Norton's coldness seemed a particularly feminine mode of self-protection. Hoping to get through to her, one night he decided to tell her the story of his own sentimental adventures. He drew up a long list of women he had known and exposed them to her frosty or indifferent gaze. She seemed unimpressed, and showed no desire to repay his confession with one of her own. In the mornings, after he called a cab, Peltier slipped soundlessly into his clothes so as not to wake her, and headed for the airport. Before he left, he would spend a few seconds watching her, sprawled on the sheets, and sometimes he felt so full of love he could have burst into tears.
This audiobook is continued on Disc 2.